as ministries, departments and agencies fast-track work on their budgets for the year 2022. Some stakeholders are concerned about the government's revenue, its expenditure and its deficit financing plans. To discuss this delicate budget balancing act is data and information consultant Babajide Ogunsanwo. Great to see you with your pack of dominoes. Good evening. You always have something to show us, something to, to illustrate what you're saying tonight. But let's dig in. It seems that the biggest concern in the medium-term expenditure framework and the fiscal strategy paper is all about the deficit, about how it will be financed. What is your take on this?
There are several ways to look at this. It's like seeing dominoes fall. I like to take it from that perspective, and that's because whenever leadership you look at their behavior and decisions, and whenever leadership behavior and decisions are irrational, then the economy becomes uncertain, unpredictable. And when the economy becomes unpredictable, then it makes it tougher for businesses to make forecasts. And when businesses cannot make forecasts that are foreseeable, then they do not hire. And when companies do not hire, then citizens do not have jobs. When citizens do not have jobs, then citizens do not spend money. And when citizens do not spend money, the economy becomes smaller. And when the economy becomes smaller, government's revenue becomes smaller. And when government's revenue becomes smaller, then the government borrows more money. So tonight, I come with good and bad news. So let's start with the good news first. And the good news is the government, despite the financing deficit challenges, is making progress on economic diversification. And that is the fact. If we look at the fact since 1999 to date, what we see is that in 2006, 89%, as much as 89% of all the money that came into the Federation account came from oil. As when the government came in 2014, for instance, 67% of all the revenue that got into the Federation account, 67% of all the money that went into the Federation account came from oil. As of last year, we're seeing a more balanced distribution between oil and non-oil. So at the moment, the Federation account came from oil. So that is the fact. That is the good news, is that the economy is becoming more diversified and non-oil is contributing more. Non-oil is contributing. We're seeing the impact of non-oil to the budget. Now to the bad news, because we cannot talk about the good news without talking about the bad news. Now the bad news is what you talked about. And if we take a look at it, how much is the federal government borrowing?
Before you talk about that, some say that the government has the capacity then to borrow more. Others say, okay, how will we pay the debt? The ones we're owing and even the ones we're planning to borrow. Is there anything that worries you about, the budget deficit of the federal government?
There's a lot that I'm concerned about regarding the deficit. For instance, if we look at how much between 1999 to 2014, cumulatively within those 16 years, the cumulative deficit of the federal government within those 16 years, 1999 to 2014, was 7.7 trillion naira. 16 years cumulative deficit of 7.7 trillion naira. You could write that down. Now, between 2015 to 2020, the facts from the central bank shows that cumulative deficits between those 6 years, 2015 to 2020, cumulative deficit is in excess of 22 trillion naira. So we've seen significantly not just more borrowing, but we've seen that deficit go wider. But the question we should then ask ourselves is, why is the government borrowing so much? And it's 10 words. And if you take a look at the facts, it is because there is so much to be done, yet so little is available. And that is what we have in front of us, which shows the deficit to the revenue ratio. We see as at 2020, last year, 155% ratio between deficit and revenue. As at 2008, it was only 1%. In 2014, it went to 22%. At the moment, we have a deficit to revenue ratio of 100%. 155%. And that is what is bothering a lot of stakeholders, not just why are we borrowing, but because the deficit to revenue ratio is so high.
Indeed. What then will be the implication of this deficit on us, the common man, next year?
First is the common man. I don't know if you're a common lady.
We're all common men.
But the first is you need to also have your budget. As the federal government is working on its own deficit financing plans for families, they also need to be able to look at how much are you earning, how much do you want to spend, and how do you want to plug this. But I also want to talk about the need for the government to also rethink some of the assumptions in the budget. We are looking at a 6.5 trillion naira revenue for next year, but the fact shows that never in our history has the federal government even retained revenue of 5 trillion naira. And yet we are looking at projections of a 6.5 revenue inflow for next year. Same thing with expenditure. Expenditure outflow next year of 14 trillion naira. In 2020, it was only 10 trillion naira. So we need to rethink all these assumptions. And in the final analysis, let's remember the words of Oscar Wilde, an Irish poet. He said that an idea that is not dangerous is not an idea at all. And so going forward, we need to rethink the ideas that drive our budgets. Borrowing is an idea, but it's not a dangerous idea. We need to rethink of other alternative ways to grow the economy that is dangerous and wouldn't really create danger for the common man.
Babajide, always a pleasure having you here. Thank you for putting it so succinctly.
The pleasure is all mine.